Well, as many of you know, we continue to work through our preaching series called The Marks of the Church. And it is from this chapter 2 of the book of Acts, which describes what the early church was like. What were the characteristics of these first apostles who followed the way and eventually called themselves Christians? And we know that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They devoted themselves to fellowship. They devoted themselves to the breaking of the bread, and they devoted themselves to the prayers. Those are the 4 marks of the early church, and they should be our marks as well. We've got a slide up there that shows the graphic that you also have on your bulletins. And we know that being devoted to the apostles' teaching, well, that makes sense. Makes plenty of sense to be devoted to the apostles' teaching. We talked about that for 2 weeks. We know it makes plenty of sense to be devoted to fellowship, and we talked about that for 2 weeks, this fellowship that binds us together, having Jesus Christ in common. And then you get to the third one that says they devoted themselves to the breaking of bread. Well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, breaking of bread is important. It's part of being together, sharing a meal together, and Jesus would have shared lots of meals together with his disciples and the people following him. Of course, we shared a meal here last night, and many of you were here to break bread last night as part of our homecoming dinner. But to be devoted to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking the bread, and having the breaking the bread be one of those 3 main devotions, bread is a pretty simple thing. And back in Jesus' time, bread was just a staple part of the diet. Think about things that are staple parts of the diet these days. You could say rice and beans. I am devoted to rice and beans. Depends what part of the country you're in. Maybe another part of the country you'd be devoted to peanut butter and jelly. Staple part of the diet, just like bread. I know somebody that ate peanut butter and jelly every single day that she went to school since K all the way through 12. But to be devoted to peanut butter and jelly in the same way you're devoted to the teachings about Jesus and the fellowship of Christ. Another part of the country you might be devoted to shrimp and grits. South Carolina, maybe. And then the last one that I put up there, you might be devoted to meat and potatoes. Does it make sense to be devoted to the breaking of the bread, devoted to meat and potatoes? I mean, that's what that sort of means. Well, maybe we need to ask ourselves a little bit more about what the Bible is talking about when we talk about the breaking of the bread. And that's why we have the gospel story that we have today. It's called the Road to Emmaus gospel story. It shows up in Luke 24. It is not just one of the great stories of the New Testament, it's just one of the great stories, period. And I want to talk a little bit about this story of the road to Emmaus. You know, you have these people who don't recognize Jesus as they're walking along the road. It reminds me of a story of a young girl drawing a picture. And her parents say to her, what are you drawing a picture of? She said, I'm drawing a picture of God. The parents say, well, that's kind of silly. Nobody knows what God looks like. She said, they will when I finish my picture. Well, in this story of the road to Emmaus, these people walking along the road, they don't recognize Jesus, and then they do recognize Jesus. Not so much because of what he looks like, but because of something that he does. Let's take a look at this great story piece by piece. Again, it's called the road to Emmaus because Emmaus was this village near Jerusalem, and there were these 2 disciples. They weren't part of the inner circle. They were 2 of the extended disciples, men and women who followed Jesus along the way. There were many of them. And they're totally dejected. They're totally downcast because this story takes place after Jesus has died. Jesus has been crucified. Jesus has been taken away from them. It's this very confusing and difficult time, although there was this glimmer of hope because somebody went to the tomb and they didn't find the body, and then there was a vision of angels. So there's this dejection, but also a glimmer of hope. And these 2 disciples are walking along the road to Emmaus when suddenly Jesus, in his resurrected form, comes and walks with them. But they don't recognize him as Jesus. They recognize him as just another traveler. And Jesus sort of starts quizzing them. And he said, well, why so sad? Why the long face? He said, are you the only person in this area who hasn't heard of what's going on in Jerusalem? How Jesus of Nazareth, this messianic figure, came triumphantly entering into the city, but then was handed over and betrayed and crucified as a criminal on a cross? Are you the only one that hasn't heard about this? And they talk a little bit more, and they continue down the road, and finally it says they reach a house. And Jesus goes into the house with them. And on the next slide, it tells us what he did. They sat down to eat. And Jesus, like he had done so many times before, took bread, blessed it, broke it, and shared it. And then they recognized him. And suddenly, as if scales had fallen from their eyes, they recognized that this was Jesus. And then he disappeared. Now, this tells us a little bit about his resurrected self. It is familiar in one way, but unfamiliar and unfathomable in another way. It actually tells us a little bit about what our own resurrections are going to be like, even as mysterious and extraordinary as that sounds. It will be in one way familiar and in another way unfamiliar. But more importantly for this sermon, they knew who he was when he broke the bread. And this is part of why we talk about the apostles being devoted to the breaking of the bread. Now, what was it? Did Jesus have kind of a tricky way of breaking the bread? Did he hold his hands in just such a way? I'm going to need some volunteers. Can I have anybody raise their hand who wants to be volunteer today? Yes, please. Come right up front. Anybody else? This one's easy. Yes, please. Come right up front. Yes, please. Come right up front. Yes, please. Come right up front. Anybody else? Yes, please. Come right up front. Yes, please. Come right up front. Yes, please. Come right up front. Anybody else? Yes, please. Come right up front. So I have some bread here. This is pretty simple, ordinary-looking bread, and I want to see the most interesting way that you can break this bread. Let your creativity run wild, okay? Think of if you can figure out a really cool way to break this bread. So I'll give you that, and don't do it yet. You're all going to do it at once. Okay, so think about in your head how you might go about breaking this bread. Think of a really cool way to do it. And on the count of 3, you all are going to break this bread in the most interesting way that you can think of. 1, 2, 3, go. Pretty good. Give them a round of applause. Not bad. Thank you very much. Thank you for breaking the bread.
I want to eat the bread.
Now that was pretty interesting. So was it because Jesus had like a special way of doing it? He kind of broke the bread behind his back, or he sort of held his pinkies out when he broke the bread, or broke the bread kind of like that, and a little flourish. And then they knew him. It's like, oh, that's exactly how Jesus used to break the bread. He used to, go like that after he broke the bread. LeBron James, maybe. I think we need to look a little bit deeper about this notion of breaking bread. Did he have something else kind of going on in this notion of breaking bread? Well, sure. Because first of all, it's not just breaking, it's a 4-part action. We've got it right there in the verse. After Jesus sat down to eat, he took some bread, he blessed it, then he broke it, and then he gave it. He took some bread. Let's talk about that for a minute. Jesus, by all accounts, was not a baker. He probably didn't make any bread himself. He was a carpenter, as we know. But there are so many stories where Jesus is at table, at fellowship. None of these stories involve Jesus inviting anybody over his own house. They all involve Jesus often inviting himself over other people's house. And he is at table with folks in their houses, and he takes their bread and chooses to take their bread and then blesses it and breaks it and gives it. Even in perhaps the most famous story of Jesus breaking bread, when he feeds the thousands of people, right? Was it bread that Jesus brought along himself? It was somebody else that brought the bread to him. He said, "What do you have?" And they said, "Well, we've got 5 loaves of bread and a few fishes." And they brought the bread to Jesus to see what he would do. And it says, Jesus took the bread. And in this story, they had bread at the house. Look, Jesus has just been crucified and resurrected. He didn't take any bread with him. He took the bread that was at the house, and he didn't look at it and say, oh, is this all you have? He didn't look at it and say, if we could only get some sesame seeds, it would be a little bit nicer. He took the bread that they gave him. Might have been old, might have been stale, whatever it was, Jesus took it and accepted it and blessed it. So we start thinking about ourselves and what we have to offer Jesus. And sometimes there's this notion that we have to be, totally polished, that we have to have our act totally together in order to present ourselves to Jesus. Not so. Jesus will take whatever bread we offer, and he will accept it, not because of anything that we've done, but through something called grace. Jesus looks at us, our staleness, our crumbliness, our lackings, knowing all the things that we've done, all the ways that we've felt short, and we come with this old stale bread to Jesus, and Jesus chooses us and takes it, just as he took this bread before he blessed it and broke it. Some people like to say when they found Jesus, they say, I found Jesus when I was 20 years old, or I found Jesus when I was 10 years old. And of course, there's a joke that goes along with that. Oh, you found Jesus? Where was he? Under the couch? Other people might switch it and say, Jesus found me. Jesus found me when I was 20 years old. Jesus found me when I was 10 years old. Jesus found me last week, people might say. I heard somebody else say it even better. Actually, it was Shelley Taft. And he said, Jesus caught hold of me when I was 10 years old. Jesus caught hold of me when I was 10 years old. I like that best of all. Jesus reaches out, chooses us, takes us, and wraps us in his arms. Through his grace and his love, he takes whatever we have to offer, wherever we might be. He meets us where we are, and then he enfolds us in himself that we may become the person that he needs us to be. That's the second part, the blessing part. When we talk about blessing, we think about maybe just saying something nice to somebody. But blessing is telling somebody who and what they can become. That's the biblical understanding of blessing. And so Jesus not only takes us, but he calls us by name. He speaks to us and says, plans I have laid for you. Plans to prosper. Plans for good and not for bad. Jesus takes us and blesses us. And you may know the very moment that Jesus caught hold of you. Or maybe it was kind of a long process, and you can look back and know that Jesus was slowly catching hold of you. Maybe it's happening to you right now. Jesus is slowly taking hold of you over the course of this very week or this very month. I think about my parents picking me up from camp. Has anybody ever been to overnight camp? Overnight summer camp? Okay. I was there for a month. And in a month, a lot can go right and a lot can go wrong. Well, this year I had gotten poison ivy, and it was so bad that it was all over my arms and all over my face, and I had to get special medicine for it, but it was so on my face, and I had scratched it so much that it was puffed out from my face, so I kind of looked like a swollen ogre with my poison ivy. And I had lost a couple things. I had lost my glasses. That wasn't good. And, of course, I hadn't washed my clothes, and my sleeping bag stunk, and all my clothes stunk, and my shirt was all dirty that my mom had bought for me. But after a month, my parents came to pick me up, and they must have gotten out of the car and taken a look at just the wretch that was standing before them, the poison ivy, ogre face, no glasses, smelly clothes, smelly sleeping bag. And I went, running up to my parents. I said, Mom, I lost my glasses. I'm so sorry. They said, what happened to your face? But then it was, none of that mattered because it was just this embrace. It was this hug. It was, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to take you home. When we come before Jesus with our stale bread, it's the same way. He wraps us in his arms. He takes us up. He chooses us. He receives us. He meets us where we are. And then he blesses us. He tells us the plans that he has for us, the plans for good and not for bad. We're going to talk a little bit more about the breaking of the bread next week in Breaking the Bread Part 2. But I hope this gets us started understanding why the apostles, why the early church, and why we as a church need to devote ourselves and cling to this notion of Jesus breaking the bread. It said they clung, they devoted themselves to the breaking of the bread and the prayers. There we are. It is a process not of just breaking bread, but taking and blessing, receiving, loving, all through his grace. And that is something worth devoting ourselves to, worth clinging to. Amen.